Welcome everyone to this week's edition of the Commercial Real Estate 101 meetup. For those of you guys who are tuning in for the first time, this is a bi-monthly meetup that we have where we invite speakers really from all across the country to talk about different concepts pertaining to commercial real estate. And today we have Brad Butler, who's affiliated with Frost Brown Todd here locally in Louisville, Kentucky, to talk about affordable housing. He specializes in these types of projects. And so for those of you guys who are either working as brokers or your developers dealing in this space, I think it's going to be extremely beneficial, and especially if you're looking to invest in these types of properties. I mean, this is a pretty unique opportunity, and I think that today's presentation will be able to enlighten you guys on the process. So Brad, I'll take it away.
Perfect. Yeah, again, thank you guys for the opportunity to let me come speak today to you about affordable housing. I know it's always a very interesting topic, and these are pretty lively debates and discussions. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'm not sure what the mechanism is on Zoom, but
yeah, what we'll go ahead and do is we'll let you do the presentation, then we'll have a Q&A at the end as well. And so this will also be recorded on YouTube and in a podcast format. So if there's some visual on the actual screen, if you don't mind kind of explaining what that is as well, because we have people who listen to this afterwards, either in a podcast or video format. So feel free to, use that.
Sounds great. Yeah. So, so today we're going to be talking about affordable housing, and specifically the low-income housing tax credit, which is what allows affordable housing to really flourish financially and makes these deals financially feasible. Okay. So who am I? I am Brad Butler. I'm an attorney with Frost Brown Todd, and I specialize in affordable housing. I represent both developers and investors in the creation and disposition of affordable housing properties across the country. With Frost Brown Todd, what can we really do for you all? What value can we bring to you? Well, we're a large full-service firm based here in the Midwest. Our primary offices are in Louisville and Cincinnati, but we have a very large geographic footprint. We actually just opened an office in DC as well, so we could stay at the front of any kind of legislative changes. And there'll be something I mention here at the end about that as well. And we also have the multifamily housing industry team, and I am on the leadership team for that. And it's a group of attorneys at Frost who focus on real estate, finance, tax, corporate, securities, estate planning, litigation, and everyone has a deep experience in multifamily. So unlike a lot of other law firms where you go and you might find a real estate person, we have real estate people that know how to do multifamily deals, or securities people who know what a PPM and lend offering looks like in a real estate context. So something to keep in mind. It's something we can definitely deliver extra value to you all through. And if you guys ever have any questions, feel free to reach out. So what is the low-income housing tax credit? What is LIHTC? I'm going to use that acronym a lot. It is the low-income housing tax credit, and it is reflected in Section 42 of the Internal Revenue Code. And a quick discussion about the difference between a credit and a deduction. I'm sure we have some finance people and some CPAs here, but essentially, a deduction will reduce the amount of income that you use to calculate what your tax liability is. A credit is an actual dollar for dollar reduction of what you have to write a check for at the end of the day. So for example, let's say a taxpayer has $1 million in tax liability that they owe the government, but you have $400,000 of tax credits, which will offset that. Therefore, you only have to actually write a check for the net amount, which is $600,000. This is attractive to investors, not only because a credit's always a good thing, because typically you can realize that early in the process, but also because they're acquiring a dollar for dollar reduction through the credit for less than an actual dollar. Usually it's around 90 cents or so. So what is affordable housing? It's not necessarily Section 8 or public housing. I know that's a common misconception that a lot of people have. And I'm sure that if you guys look around your city or your town or your region, you are going to find several LIHTC properties. And I would bet if they are new construction or they have been developed fairly recently, they will probably be of a very high quality at the higher end of the market, believe it or not. So what are the two types of LIHTC that we're going to talk about? There's two types of credits, the 4% and the 9%. The 4% credit are what you can use on acquisitions or new constructions or rehabilitations of existing properties. So an example would be if you buy an existing apartment complex and you want to redevelop it, and you'd be able to take credits on both the acquisition costs as well as those rehabilitation expenditures. It's a non-competitive application, and one of its defining characteristics is the use of tax-exempt bonds. A 9% credit can only be used on new construction or the actual rehabilitation expenses themselves. You don't get to use that on the acquisition cost of an existing building. Typically, this will be new construction and you'll acquire vacant land, or you'll buy some old rundown building and just demo it before you actually build up what you're expecting to develop. And this is a competitive allocation. Sorry, what was that?
No, I'm not. I think there may have been someone who unmuted. Sorry about that.
Okay, yeah, no worries.
Yeah. And then real quick, Brad, if you could share, I think your slides, are you referencing slides right now? I just want to make sure because it doesn't look like it's fully shared. So I just want to make, if you want to like share it.
Yeah, are you only seeing the first page?
Yeah, I was only staying at the first page. So yeah, sorry about that. I think that'll help a little bit with making sure everyone knows where we're at. So, and if you want to, you can even go into slideshow mode if you want, and then you can have it, or however you want to do it.
Well, I was doing a slideshow. Can you see the screen right now?
We can, yeah. It's just, it just wasn't moving along with it. So that was it. So
no worries. Do you see me floating now between them?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so we'll do it this way. Okay. So, this would have made a whole lot more sense than if that was on the screen. But essentially 4%, 9%, and 9% is competitive, and you're going to see it a lot of the times with new construction. 4% is going to be defined by the use of tax-exempt bonds, and you can use it on acquisitions, rehabilitations, or new construction. So how do we calculate what the actual amount of the credit is going to be? Well, there's 4 things we need to consider. First, what is the eligible basis for the project? So that amount is essentially going to be whatever your adjusted basis in the building is. So basically all the costs you put into acquiring or developing the building less the cost of land. Then you have to consider what the applicable fraction is. And that is determined by looking at what is the relative fraction of low-income units in the building relative to market units, and what the actual floor space percentage is. And it'll be whatever the lesser of those two is. Then we have a qualified basis, which is determined by looking at the eligible basis and multiplying that by the applicable fraction. So the idea is here, what are the costs you're putting into this project? What percentage of this project is actually going to be affordable? And then we come up with a number, which is the qualified basis. Once we have that, we need to look at what type of credit we have, which is the applicable credit percentage, which ties back to whether it's a 4% or a 9% deal. So let's run through 2 examples. I'm very much a numbers person, so sorry for boring everybody watching and listening right now. So let's say we have a 4% new construction deal, 150 units, all low income, with total development costs, including the land and the acquisition, of about $10 million. We have an appraisal that says the land value is $1 million. So as we talked about on the last slide, we're going to look at the eligible basis, which are all the costs we put in, less the cost of the land. So our eligible basis here is $9 million. Then, because the project is 100% low income, we have to multiply that $9 million times 100%, because that's the applicable fraction. And then we have to account for the applicable percentage, which is 4%. So that 9 million times 100% times 4% yields $360,000 as an annual credit. But we're going to talk about this a little bit later in the presentation, but it's a 10-year credit. So we would multiply this $360,000 amount times 10 to show we would actually generate about $3.6 million in credits. And for other reasons we'll talk about here shortly, the investor would be looking at about a 99.99% interest in the partnership, and they'd pay about 90% or 90 cents on the dollar for each of the credit. So based on a $3.6 million total yield for total credits, we'd be looking at about $3.239 million in investor equity raised. Another example, 9% acquisition rehab will really illustrate why there's a big difference between a 4% and a 9% credit.
Hey, Brad, real quick, it doesn't look like your slide's moving. Just wanted to clarify. Try it again. Just try it again real quick. Because I don't know. You may have 2 screens, so it may just be showing up on your other screen and not really on ours. I just want to make sure that you're able to.
Yeah. Do you guys see where it says 4% at the top now?
No, it still says credit amount calculation.
Okay. How about right now?
Yes.
Okay, so it's this screen. Sorry, I have a panel of screens. All right, so 4%.
If you don't mind, could you run through that example again, just so people will understand? Because I think people were getting lost just now. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries at all. So again, 4% new construction. So 150 units, 100% low income. Total development costs, including land, would be $10 million. Land value of $1 million. That would give us an eligible basis of $9 million because we can't account for the cost of land. The qualified basis then would be that eligible basis amount times the applicable fraction, which is 100%, because we said it was 100% low income, which would yield $9 million, times the 4% credit, which is the applicable percentage, would give us $360,000. Over a 10-year period, we would generate $3,600,000 in credits. Because the investor would take a 99.99% interest and they'd be paying 90 cents on the dollar, that means the investor will be on the hook for about $3,239,676. And you guys can see this slide this time, so it probably makes a little bit more sense. So moving on to a 9% example, which is going to involve both the acquisition of an existing building as well as its rehabilitation. We'll say there's 130 units, all low income again, with a purchase price in the PSA of $12 million. Again, with an appraisal, which will provide us a breakout of the land value, we know that's $2 million. So the building value, the eligible basis in this situation, would be $10 million. That $10 million is the qualified basis because the eligible basis of $10 million multiplied by, again, the 100% applicable fraction, all of the property is low income, would yield $10 million. And as we talked about earlier, even though it's a 9% deal, we still have to use the 4% applicable credit percentage on the acquisition portion of it, just because the 9% credit is competitive, and we'll talk about it a little bit more here shortly as to why it is. So in this situation, that 4% times 10 million would yield 400,000. Again, over 10 years, that would be $4 million, with similar economics at a 99.99% interest to the investor at 90 cents on the dollar for the credit. That would yield about $3.6 million in investor equity for the acquisition piece. But we'd also need to account for the rehabilitation piece. So moving on to the next slide, we would see that we have total development costs here of about $12 million. And because we're not accounting for any land costs here, because we already determined what the acquisition credit basis was, we would have the full $12 million in eligible basis. Again, it's 100% low income, so 100% times 12 million would be a $12 million qualified basis. However, this time we do get to use that 9% amount. So 12 million times 9% is 1,080,000, and over 10 years, we're talking about $10.8 million. Similar economics at the 99.99% interest with a 90 cent price per credit. We're looking at total equity of between the acquisition and the rehab of $13,318,000. And if you guys look back at this prior slide, we were talking about an acquisition of 12 million, development costs of 12 million. So total all in about $24 million, but we're raising a little over 13 million in equity on it. So it's favorable. So the credit delivery schedule, we were talking about accounting for a 10-year period. So how do we, what are the timeframes? What are the relevant considerations we need to keep in mind? So low-income housing tax credit is a 10-year credit. Technically, it's 120 months as opposed to 10 calendar years. So it would be 120 months from whenever you place in service. So you might have a partial year in year one, then 9 full years, plus the rest of the credit from year 1 in year 11. So for example, if we had, say, $1 million annual credit amount, and we placed in service and certain other conditions were met, but we could realize the credits as of July 1, 2021, we would get to recognize half of that amount. So $500,000 this year, and then $1 million the next 9 years, and then the remaining $500,000 in year 11. And while you're negotiating price in the prior examples, when we were talking about the investor paying 90 cents on the credit, 90 cents on the dollar for each of the credits, that ends up being a function of the projections the investor developed, the time value of money, how do we hit specific yield thresholds, IRR targets, and you adjust your capital contributions. Not all of that equity comes in at day one, as you guys would expect. With sophisticated investors, a lot of the times you'll see them actually do it in increments or installments. So I have bored you guys with the math. I've shown you the numbers. We've talked about how long you recognize the credit, but what is affordable housing at the end of the day? Affordable housing means, just as it sounds, it's affordable to the actual tenants. It's Specifically, it means that the tenants are not going to be paying more than 30% of their income towards rent and utilities. I know a common question is, well, that gets a little tedious tracking it for 1, 2, 300 tenants at a time. What's your exact figure? So the IRS did grant a little bit of a reprieve there by allowing you to designate specific income thresholds for the unit. So typically you'll see a 60% AMI restriction, area median income, which means that the tenant would be realizing or making 60% of the average income in the area. And it's adjusted based on family size. So if it's one person, it's one number, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So they wouldn't pay more than 30% of whatever that threshold is. The landlord has the option to either pay the utilities themselves, in which case they could charge the full amount of rent to the tenants if it's supported within the market, or they would have to account for a utility allowance if they pass those through to the actual tenants themselves. So if your maximum amount might be $700, if you have utility allowances, it's going to be dependent upon whatever state you're in, but you might be looking at a max rent that you could actually charge of say $600 or so. But that really gets into the underwriting of it when you guys look at the numbers when you're really negotiating with the investor. So that is generally what affordability is, but the other consideration is what is the set aside that you are going to elect. So we talked about the idea of the applicable fraction, which is the lesser of whatever the low income unit mix is relative to the floor space attributable to the actual low income units. But the IRS doesn't want you having 2 or 3 units that are affordable and trying to get some small amount of credits. At the end of the day, you're going to have to elect to do one of these 3 things, where at least 40% of the units in the project are at a 60% AMI, 20% of the units are at a 50% AMI, so they're skewing deeper, so the rents are going to be smaller because the income is smaller, or this relatively new concept called income averaging, which means that the designated thresholds for the various units have to average out to 60% or less. The benefit of that is obviously you can go above 60%, but you have to skew deeper, meaning you have to look at smaller thresholds, usually around 30 or 40% on other units to offset that. There hasn't been a lot of investors that are super comfortable with this idea yet. So we do run into a lot of tough negotiations when developers and sponsors want to use income averaging, but usually there's a way to get comfortable with it. And typically that means we would have a lower threshold rather than 60%. It might mean the average needs to be like 57 or 58% just to give yourself a little cushion. So how long do these actual restrictions have to last? Well, as we talked about, the credit period is a 10-year period where you recognize that credit amount for 10 years. But you have to actually comply with the affordability restrictions for a longer period of time. Pursuant to the Internal Revenue Code, you have to do it for 15 years, which is called the compliance period. And if you don't comply with the actual restrictions set forth in Section 42, you run the risk of recapture, which would be the IRS knocking on the partnership's door. And I would assume most of the people here are investors, developers, and so it's a real concern. They're going to want their credits back, and somebody's going to have to write a check at the end of the day to make the government whole. So we want to avoid that, certainly for that first 15 years. But once we get into year 16, it doesn't mean we can do whatever we want. It's just that at that point, the IRS doesn't administer the program anymore, and it'll be a state by state basis, evaluation, and governance. So usually we're looking at a 15-year period at that point. So a subsequent 15 years, so a total of 30 years of affordability. But some states like California and Maryland are going to have significantly higher. For example, 40 years as opposed to 15 years. So that would be something you guys factor in when you're looking at what the back end is for your own profits as an investor. So the application process, the 9% credit is a competitive credit. The 4% credit is not a competitive credit on its face, but it really is. So what do I mean by competitive? Well, each state is allocated a certain amount of credits that they can give to developers for their projects each year. It's going to be based on state population size. So bigger states have more credits, smaller states have fewer credits they can actually give out. And obviously, because certain small states, an example would be Kentucky, the pool is very limited. So it can get very competitive because you have a lot of very good, sophisticated developers presenting their projects, asking for credits. The problem is there's never enough credits. So what the states will do is they put out this document called the QAP, which is its Qualified Allocation Plan, which will allow the developers to understand what the state wants to see from a development perspective, both location, the types of amenities, the types of entities doing deals, for example, nonprofits, with specific AMI thresholds. So who do they want to target as potential tenants? Who do they want to benefit from this? So you can basically look at the rules, you can put your deal together, and then you submit. And at that point, most of the time, most states will go through and it's a point system. So if you have certain amenities or certain locations, things to that effect, you would get points, 2 points, 3 points, 4 points. At the end of the day, the projects with the most points will usually win the allocation and get the credits. So for 4% deals, though, the benefit to a 4% deal is that if they are financed with tax-exempt bonds in certain ways, the credits allocated pursuant to the 4% credits will not count against that 9% cap. So that's why we say it's not competitive, because it's not limited in that regard. But because states, again, are limited by the amount of tax-exempt bonds they can issue based on population size, they are theoretically limited and capped in that way. And a lot of states have one application if you're going to do a 4% deal. So again, they're looking at everything holistically, and they'll figure out whether or not you can do the deal. And as part of the application process too, this isn't just here's my theoretical project. You really have to invest some money and some time and effort into putting it together. A lot of the diligence that you have to submit with the application is similar to a regular real estate deal. You'd have to put together an underwriting model. You would typically need a market study to support your rent assumptions and your expense assumptions. You would need an appraisal. You would need to demonstrate site control, which is typically either a purchase and sale agreement or just evidence that you already own the property through an affiliate or through the actual entity that will end up doing the deal. Organizational documents and similar type underwriting stuff that you would expect when you've done loans or with big commercial lenders. That similar types of stuff. So specifically, what does the debt structure look like? Because we talked about how we finance the equity piece of it. So on 4% deals, again, the defining characteristic is the use of tax-exempt bonds or notes, but just tax-exempt obligations and financing, which would be issued through some local governmental entity. The 50% rule is something to keep in mind here. So when I was talking about whether if they're financed by tax-exempt bonds, they won't count against the cap, so long as the project is financed by these bonds to the effect of at least 51% of the total cost of the land in the building are financed with the proceeds of the bonds. So that's where they really had that restriction in place as to how many deals they can allow developers to do, because it's limited in the sense that they can only finance so many projects, and because at least 51% of the project has to be financed with these the bonds, it severely limits it. Other loans, though, it would be what you would expect. It could be a short-term bond with agency takeout, so Freddie, Fannie, or you could do a HUD takeout. Usually it's a 221F or a 223F or a 221D specifically. Or you would just have a construction to perm bond. You see that less frequently. Equity bridge loans, subordinate cash flow loans, typically from state agencies or nonprofits whose mission is to create affordable housing, because a lot of these loans don't end up getting repaid. And then deferred developer fees. So developers end up getting a separate fee for putting the project together and orchestrating everything. But most states require a deferred developer fee to be shown to show that the developer actually has some skin in the game. At the end of the day, since the deferred developer fee would functionally be a loan that gets paid out of cash flow. And on 9% deals, we don't have bonds. And because there's more equity, you're going to see a lot less debt, which allows the projects to charge less in rent because there's less financing costs associated with carrying the deal. So we'll see a short-term construction loan where large equity payment will just take that out. Some smaller subordinate loans that are in place or deferred payment loans. Again, because a 9% deal is competitive, and a lot of the times they're going to be very, very high end low-income housing projects, a lot of the nonprofits that usually contribute to these types of deals are basically making grants, but for tax reasons, we can't say it's a grant. And then similarly, bridge loans, subordinate cash flow loans, and deferred developer fees here as well. So here's what a basic org chart would look like for one of these deals. We would have the tax credit entity limited partnership, which would be the fee owner. I keep saying partnership, but it can be an LLC, but the entity has to be taxable as a partnership at the end of the day. You'll see a general partner, which is the developer affiliate, and then you'll see the large investor partner, which is usually a syndicator when you're doing a large scale LIHTC project. The general partner will realize a 0.01% interest in profits and losses and just other partnership tax items. And then the investor recognizes that 99.99% interest. However, there's a 90% cash flow split to the GP and a 10% to the investor in most deals. Some syndicators fluctuate between 80 and 90, but usually you can bank on probably around 90%. And then again, you can see the developer off to the right. There'll usually be a separate development fee too that allows the sponsor to recognize, get some sort of payment in the short term ahead of a lot of ahead of the life of the deal. We'll put it that way. So when you're putting the deal together, though, the three documents that are really core in this consideration outside of the loan documents are going to be the partnership agreement, the guarantee, and the development agreement. And the partnership agreement is going to differ greatly from what you would usually see in a typical syndication deal if you're just buying a regular market rate multifamily property. Even if you are raising private equity and you're doing some sort of security offering, there's a lot more, there are several more obligations that the general partner will be responsible for that you wouldn't be accustomed to. Specifically, those things are going to be, what does the completion guarantee look like? What are the operating deficit guarantee obligations? So if the project is hemorrhaging money, do you have to write a check at the end of the day? And if so, what's the threshold? Credit recapture provisions, who really bears the risk and in what circumstance, and how can you carve out some of that liability as the GP, and how can you push that on to the investor reasonably? Environmental obligations, and then repurchase and removal. These are really the big ticket items when you're negotiating one of these deals. Repurchase being that if something happens, even if it's not a bad act of the general partner or the developer or one of their affiliates, what can the investor do? And usually it would be that they have to buy the investor out at a very specific price that you negotiate, where it's all capital contributed plus some sort of interest plus a penalty percentage. And it can get nasty when you're fighting through those. And similarly with removal, it's the exact opposite. As opposed to the investor making you buy them out, they just try to keep you out of your own deal. And what sort of recourse do you have? What kind of cure rights do you have? Just a lot of things to consider. And if you guys ever do a LIHTC project and you cross that bridge, it's really important that you reach out to a LIHTC attorney that knows what they're doing, as opposed to just a regular real estate lawyer, because I can assure you they would be well over their head. So like we were saying, cash flow splits are usually 90% to the general partner, 10% to the limited partner, and any kind of capital event proceeds or refinancing, similarly 90% to the GP and then 10% to the investor. And then you see the typical fees, local admin fees. So it's basically a preferred return on a cumulative basis to the investor, a lease up fee to the GP. So that'll be paid as it's earned. Supervisory management fees, that's essentially a preference payment to the GP in the waterfall, but it's going to be subordinate to a lot of the other payments that are made through the waterfall. And then the developer fees. So this is always the slide that gets a lot of questions. So we've talked about, how do you calculate the credit amount? How long do you recognize the credit for? How long do you have to stay affordable? And what does the deal look like? But ultimately, as a developer and a sponsor, what you really care about is, how do I get control of this project at the end of the day to either re-syndicate or sell and recognize the true value, which in like most syndications is going to be found on the back end when you sell and you get your much larger disproportionate interest in those proceeds. So The most common ways are going to be through an investor buyout or buying the project. And usually this would be triggered at the end of the compliance period. So you're going to be in the deal for about 15 years with the investor, and then you'll have the option to buy them out. Even though it'll be very formulaic in the documents, from a practical standpoint, it usually ends up being a pretty nominal amount. So when you're putting the deal together, and for example, when you were talking about the 9% deal, you might be looking at a $24 million project where the developer might have put $100 in just as a nominal capital contribution. And then in year 15, you could buy them out for $50,000 to $100,000 and take control of the project and either operate it yourself or re-syndicate it and do a new LIHTC deal, which is a pretty common thing. So you can redo a development fee or any of the front end fees that you'd expect to see. Another option is a right of first refusal. If you have an affiliated 501c3, there's certain options where if there are bona fide offers to buy the project at the end of the compliance period, where the nonprofit would have the option to buy it at a very minimal amount as well. So just something to keep in mind. I know it's a trend we're seeing a lot more where private developers are creating these nonprofits as part of their overall just portfolio, their mission, but really to be able to do a right of first refusal through this mechanism. So I definitely just threw a lot of information at you guys. So I will send out my slides as well to the group, if that's all right with you. And if there's any questions, feel free to reach out. My phone number is on there, my email's on there, and feel free to find me on LinkedIn and send a friend request. But that is all I have today. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Yeah, for sure. A great presentation, by the way, Brad. I mean, tons of information. I know the slides will be helpful. I had just in the chat box, we had like 15 people say, "Hey, can you share the slides as well?" So I think that that will be of value to people. So if you guys have a question, just to save time, just because we have like 100 people on the call, so if you guys don't mind just typing away in the chat box for your question, I'm gonna go ahead and read them off just so we can streamline the process. So we had a question from Venkat. So they were saying, up to what AMI band does 100% low income include?
So that will get into the idea of the set-asides, and it depends on what you elect. Usually you're going to see it targeted to 60% AMI or less. That'll be the general rule of thumb when you're thinking about putting your deal together and doing some preliminary underwriting. However, if you do the income averaging concept, it can go as high as 80%, even though most developers will be a little bit more cautious and cap it at 70%.
Great question. All right, we've had a couple people ask about the recording. This is recorded and it will be live tomorrow. I'll be posting it in the group as well, so you guys will have that recording. Okay. We had a question from Juan. All right, so generally, what is the smaller amount of tax credits investors would be interested in? If projects are too small, can they be bundled?
So the real response to that is whether or not you'd be able to get credits to begin with. On a 9% deal, you're probably, depending on the area, because certain states, Alaska, I think I've done like a 35 unit project, but again, there's just different needs and different eligibility requirements. But for 4% deals, just with the costs incurred, you're probably looking at roughly at least a $15 million deal minimum, and on a 9% deal, you're probably looking at probably around 10 would be a minimum threshold.
Yeah, so these are pretty large deals that you're dealing with. And, I'll even say, as far as the affordable housing standpoint, for those of you guys who are, newer to the market or looking to get into the commercial space, I mean, there's affordable housing developers. Like, that's all they do is just build these affordable housing. So getting in with one of these corporations would be a benefit. And I know we have some local, LDG does a lot of local, there's a big local developer that does a lot of affordable housing. And in your independent markets, I guarantee you there are, affordable housing developers that operate within your market. So,
and actually to build on that too, so one of the things I was going to bring up when you're, and this is just a practical tip, and don't misconstrue this is not legal or business advice in any way, but in order to get an allocation, most states will require that you have some sort of experience, which is counterintuitive because how can you get experience without having done deals? So the common response is, well, let's partner with an existing operator, somebody that knows what they're doing. But another thing that I'm seeing a lot of, and I think it's an interesting idea, is buying these deals at the end of the extended use period. So looking at projects, between year 25 and 30, so that you can at least represent these credit agencies that you do have experience complying with the restrictions, because ultimately that's what they care about, is not just can you operate real estate, but can you operate it within actual bounds of the law and keep it affordable and keep it aligned with their expectations, because that's why they did the deal, was to keep it affordable, and that's something that they would expect you to be able to do. And beyond just buying these projects at the end of their life, you could also try to buy GPs, general partners, out at the end of the credit period or at the end of the compliance period. But the underwriting from the investor would be fairly rigorous. You would need a strong balance sheet to be able to do that, as well as a good resume, but you wouldn't need as much affordable experience. So that could also be a way to open a door with a good syndicator or investor. So not only are you getting experience, but you're also meeting someone that can actually give you the financing that you need to get the deal done.
That's actually a smart strategy too, because if you're buying the property near the end of its life, obviously the net operating income of the property is going to be somewhat suppressed just because of the fact it's an affordable housing community. So I'm curious to see if even being able to buy it would be probably more affordable than you would see like a market rate property in that scenario as well. So awesome. So we have a question from Travis. He said, is the credit delivery at CO or when the units are filled? Depending on lease up, that could change the year the credits are delivered. So yeah,
correct. So yes, certificate of occupancy. So technically it would begin when it's placed in service. And placed in service would mean when it's ready and available for its intended use. It's not a defined term in the code. Usually we measure that by CO, because a lot of these projects have waiting lists for tenants to get in beforehand, because you guys are usually doing marketing efforts and engaging in that process before it's actually constructed. But yes, you cannot claim credits on a vacant unit just because there's a CO. You need a qualified tenant in the unit, but almost always you can get it within that same month. And you only need them in there by the last day of the month for credits for the whole month.
Great point. All right. I think Travis had another question. He said, is there any situation where the additional compliance period is not mandated?
No, every state will have at least 15 years.
Some may have more. You mentioned California has what, 40 or 30 something years?
Yeah, California and Maryland are both 40. So you're looking at 55 years. A lot of the times though, based on where the properties end up being located, their highest and best use ends up being affordable housing. So you're just going to re-syndicate, meaning just do a new LIHTC deal. So maybe on the first deal, you have a new construction. And then the second deal, it's just an acquisition rehab.
Great point. All right. Venkat has another question. He said, are you allowed to double dip into LIHTC equity in both construction and permanent sources? This is assuming a ground up development.
I guess what do we mean by double dipping? Because when we do, the loan amount would be determined on the front end based on whatever its LTV restriction is. So, I mean, they're going to look at what the value is as a stabilized asset, even if it's ground up.
Yeah, if you want to clarify a little bit, that would help for sure. Thank God. All right, so Diego asked a question. He says, are all 4% deals accepted by the IRS, assuming you meet all the requirements?
Yes, assuming it's financed with the bonds and everything, you've crossed all your T's and dotted your I's with the technical filings, you've gotten all of the appropriate documents, yes, you will be able to recognize those credits.
Yeah, but does that mean that, so you were mentioning the pool of money that's available. How does that work? So with the 4% rule, do certain projects take priority over others, or how exactly is that allocated?
Yeah, fair enough. So again, because the amount of bonds, so the word in tax exempt bond world is, the phrase is volume cap, which is the finite amount of cap that a state has each year. You can actually roll over unused cap. So a lot of the times when you do one of these deals, you'll actually see a state that'll bring it from a year before or 2 years before. So it's not as competitive as 9% deals, but that's also because 4% deals are harder to make financially feasible because there's less equity. So you need more debt, but you're still looking at the suppressed the rents because it's affordable. So luckily within the last year or so, we did get what was called the 4% fixed. So I was showing you guys the math with the actual 4% number used, but up until the beginning of this year, that 4% credit was actually a floating number that was in the low threes. So you'd really be looking at about a 3.1%. So by increasing that and fixing it at 4%, that allowed projects to generate more credits, which means more equity because they're buying more credits. So that's helped address some of it, but at the end of the day, you're still looking at about half the equity, if not 60% of the equity that you'd probably have from a 9% deal.
Great point.
But once you do apply to the actual issuer, so the state, when they decide they're going to give you the bonds, and so long as they're tax exempt and you get your proper bond counsel opinions that say these are tax exempt bonds, and you do the math correctly and you finance over 50% of your costs with those bond proceeds, you're good to go.
Yeah, it's just that the bond piece is really what you're referencing. So that's the fix, because if there's not enough funds in the pot to count for that bond, I'm assuming that's where the hiccup lies, right? If so, let's say there was 100 people that wanted to be able to develop a 4% tax credit deal, but there wasn't enough. There was only enough to cover 50% of those with that requirement that you were referencing. The other 50% are they kind of hung out to dry? They're just not. They'd have to wait next year, essentially, is what you're saying.
Yeah, 100%, exactly right, because they can't finance their project with at least 50% of the bond proceeds.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. All right, so Carrie asked a question. Is there hope for tax credits to become more readily available by states and easing up on the restrictive point system?
No, and states really aren't incentivized to do it at the end of the day, just because it is an extra benefit and they can develop these. It's a benefit granted from the federal government to the states, and states are allowed to distribute them however they see fit in order to develop and grow their communities as they need to do it. So they could theoretically, but I wouldn't see that occurring. If anything, it would become more competitive as more operators and more developers enter the space.
Makes sense. All right, so Travis has a question. He says, does the resyndication happen at year 16? Not technically, but practically. I've heard that most will not support resyndication at 15 years.
Yeah. I mean, usually you have to get what the true issue is that you need to get to at least the point where you can get the investor out. And once the investor is out, then you can start doing what you need to resyndicate, because you're going to have certain LURAs, so land use, covenants on your property that would run with the land and be on the chain of title that are going to actually outline what the restrictions are on the property. So when you do a resyndication, most credit agencies are okay doing it because they're going to say, okay, well, I would have had this for another 15 years. Yeah, let's go. Another 30 years. I'm all for it.
For sure. Yeah. So Venkat had a question. Can you go over the 51% item again?
Sure. So when you're looking at the aggregate basis in the land, so basis being a tax term, so any of the costs that you are putting into the project, as well as so debt and equity, whatever costs you're putting into it are going to be whatever your basis is. And don't misconstrue that, because there's other tax consequences to whatever equity you're individually putting into your interest. But so when you're looking at all of the costs you're putting into the property, to buy the land, to develop the project, to do whatever you need to do, let's say it's 20 million bucks, at least 50% of that has to be financed with a tax exempt bond proceeds. So at a closing, the bond issuer will give you some amount, which you'll start using in construction and acquisition costs. And there usually will be a draw procedure where you actually have to get draws to reimburse your general contractors. And you just need evidence to show that the people that perform these services, the people that were paid when you acquired the property, were paid with the proceeds that you received from the issuer from those bonds. And this is actually an interesting time to bring this up too, because you guys all know that there was the big infrastructure bill that just passed. And unfortunately, nothing is going to affect LIHTC directly. But up until about 2 weeks ago, we thought we were going to get some pretty significant changes. And because we're talking about the 50% test, the relevant provision to discuss right now would be the fact that they were contemplating changing that to the 25% test. So think mathematically, if you divide that requirement in half, they could literally do twice as many deals, but didn't pass. So not too much to discuss there, but that's one of the hot topics in the industry and something you guys will see. And now that you've heard about the 4% credit and the 50% test, you'll see it every time there's a major legislative effort, since it has such strong bipartisan support. But again, because it has strong bipartisan support, unfortunately, both sides of the aisles at times will play politics and say, I'll give you this if you give me that, and then it dies.
You were mentioning that at the meetup. You were saying that how they were trying to add on different, and that happens all the time in politics. They're trying to add on their own agenda items in there, and it just kind of killed that. But you're right. I mean, the affordable housing crisis is real. It's across the country, not just centered in Kentucky or Vegas or Colorado or wherever you guys are tuning in from. And it really is a national type of issue. And hopefully down the road, there's definitely something that is implemented on a national level that can expand the opportunities as far as affordable housing communities are concerned. One thing I want to ask, and I'll get to Albert's question in a second, is how does it work for like stacking? So for example, if you buy a land in an opportunity zone and then you develop an affordable housing community on there, how does that function? I'm kind of curious if you know that.
Yeah. I mean, we don't see it as much because there's certain restrictions within the OZ regs that impact the deal. So you can't do it completely the same way that you would normally do it. But yeah, we've definitely done that. And we've combined, usually it'll be the syndicator who will raise that OZ capital themselves. So they'll invest it through the fund, and it's usually their problem to figure out at the end of the day. But so long as you're acquiring the entity, so long as you're acquiring the property from an unrelated entity, and you are distributing the funds and using the funds in the correct way, which you would work with the investor to determine when do these funds need to be used, because the OZ requires that you deploy certain funds at certain times. It's all about just getting the installment schedule correctly at the end of the day. And not only just OZ benefits, you can actually combine a low-income housing tax credit project with historic tax credits, which is a pretty common thing as well. And we see, so think of these amazing, huge, just kind of monolithic buildings that are sitting vacant that can't get it done because the financing just doesn't work by itself. But if you're able to double dip and get both LIHTC equity and historic equity, maybe the deal's feasible.
That's great. Yeah, historic tax credits can be quite lucrative as well too. So that's awesome. All right. So Albert actually had a question. He said, I'm not positive about this, but is there a $1 million cash and $10 million asset required for an entity to submit an application, no matter the size? Is that a requirement?
No, it just depends. Again, let me rephrase that. It depends on what the state's qualified allocation plan would say. I've never heard of any specific threshold like that. But there would be an application fee, which would probably be a few $1,000s, but the cost of doing business at the end of the day.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, if you're talking a few $1,000s for a $10 million project, I mean,
it's okay.
It's okay. It all works out. All right. So Travis had a question. Would the tax credit investor require that though? Oh, I'm sorry. Someone asked a question that kind of threw me off. Okay. So would the tax credit investor require that though? I think the federal investor would require that type of balance sheet. So he's asking regarding that, those,
Gotcha.
yeah.
Yeah, so usually the rule of thumb would be a $5 million net, $1 million liquidity is bare bones. You don't want to be doing a deal where you can't finance, some of these obligations that you have, because that's a whole world of hurt, separate and apart. But usually 5 million, 1 million, but similar to other deals, wherever you guys are going to have financing, you could bring in a loan guarantor if you need to. I just did a deal in Minneapolis where the developer was great, but he was young and didn't have the balance sheet. So he had brought in a partner who was just a guarantor at the end of the day, and we got the deal done.
That's awesome. All right, we have a few more questions. I'll try to make sure we keep this tight on an hour as well. So Venkat had another question. They said, may be out of scope of this presentation. Would providing new market rate units help with our affordable housing crisis as those units 20 to 30 years old dip to lower AMI bands and so forth? That's kind of a tough read. So, I mean, I think what he's saying is that,
at the end of the day, we have a shortage just on permits. It's in the tens of thousands each year, and it's going to continue to get worse as construction costs increase. Deals become less financially feasible at the end of the day. So, it's better to definitely have a unit that's more workforce oriented. So instead of that 60% and below, that 60, 80% sweet spot's a little bit different. And some states have state level credits for workforce housing, but not all states do. So that's definitely an avenue to help produce more units, because again, not everybody's in the 60% band. Some people are at 75%. Doesn't mean they're materially better off than the people at 60%. But
Yeah, you just got to standardize some sort of process, and they've just chosen 60% as being that that band. So, all right, Diego has a question. In a 4% deal, if you are able to get alternative financing, agency loans, is the 51% bond financing still applicable?
Yes, but that's what we were talking about on the slide with this idea of agency takeout. So you might have the bonds used as like a construction loan for 24 to 30 months, at which point you would refi with some sort of, we would call it like a forward Freddie, where Freddie agrees on the front end to buy the loan, or similar with Fannie Mae, where they would buy the loan at that time. In HUD world, you could also do what's called a cash collateralized 221, where essentially every time you take a draw from the bond issuer, they'll put the permanent lender will put money into a separate fund, and then the bonds will be redeemed, and then you'll move over and just have a HUD loan. So you're not stuck with bonds for 40 years necessarily. There are options, and that's pretty common.
So it's not necessarily that those bonds have to be in place as part of your package, your financing package, for a long period of time. It's just that once you do apply at the federal level, you have to have these requirements met in order to make the project function for that percentage. Is that correct?
Yep, correct. Usually investors would require that the financing be used and then remain outstanding through the first year of the credit period. And at that point, take it out. And even though there is some debate of whether you need to really do that, but usually that's the safe rule of thumb.
Sure. Cool. Well, we have time for about 1 or 2 more questions. So if you guys have any, feel free to share in the chat box. I'll be checking Facebook as well to see if we do have any other questions. So one question, we have someone watching on Facebook. They were asking, so can entry-level investors, and this investor, she has experience as a real estate investor, but maybe not in the affordable housing space. But let's say that you have a few properties under your belt and you're looking to maybe get into the affordable housing space. What type of action can you take in order to get there?
Yeah. So the question would be then to that, do you want to be a true investor? Where you're recognizing benefits from day one, or do you want to be an investor within the GP structure where you're going to recognize a lot of material benefits on the back end, but they're going to probably be higher benefits because of the entrepreneurial risk that you're taking on. The best way to do that, I mean, a lot of times you will see these sophisticated developers will bring outside money that isn't LIHTC investment into the general partner entity, where they're just going to be there, and then at the sale of the property, they're going to recognize, a significant uptick. Especially in deals where there's a gap in the sources and uses, and the GP has to come up with that equity. Most entrepreneurs and sponsors and GPs aren't going to do that themselves, so they just syndicate it to some other people through their entity. So that'd be one way to do it. If you want to get your feet into the world, the industry, working at an existing syndicator or a developer is definitely a good option. Or like we talked about earlier, looking at a property that's really on its last legs of the compliance period and potentially buying it at that point to get your experience, to get experience with that. But again, that would be still more GP entrepreneurial because you're going to have to manage the project as opposed to a true passive investor.
Yeah, I think in this case, she was referencing the GP side where it's like, take on that affordable housing project. So yeah, I think that's some great advice, and especially if you don't have any experience in affordable housing. I mean, I feel like in anything in life, if you can team up with someone who has the experience, that's really where the value is, because there's going to be a lot of things you may not even know what questions to ask,
Yeah.
and that'll hurt you even worse most of the time. So. All right. So Daniel, we'll have Daniel be the last question just because we want to respect everyone's time. So Daniel asks, what role do you see for mortgage brokers in helping developers obtain capital for affordable housing?
So at 2 levels, if you're talking about at the debt level, I mean, brokers definitely work with GPs to place loans and find loans. Or alternatively, if you're more of an equity broker, there's definitely consultants that work with syndicators to help them line up banks and insurance companies and large balance sheet investors to invest in their funds. Because at the end of the day, a syndicator is a LIHTC syndicator is literally what you would expect with a syndicator. They're raising private equity from large corporations to invest into these specific deals that the large corporations don't really have the time to look at.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Okay, cool. Well, Brad, thank you so much for your time. It was really great. I mean, I know a lot of people here got a ton of value from it. again, if you guys want to reach out to Brad, obviously you have all your contact information in here. I'd encourage you to reach out to him on LinkedIn. Yeah, he's phenomenal. And I think that if you guys are either affordable housing developers currently or looking to get in the space, I mean, one of the best contacts you can definitely have. So anyways, Brad, do you want to say anything before we sign off?
Yeah, I just very much appreciate the opportunity. Glad you guys could come join. I get really passionate talking about affordable housing. It's not something I just do. It's something I really enjoy and care about doing. So yeah, if you guys have any questions at any time on both affordable housing or just multifamily housing, I'm happy to help. This is what I do. It's what I love.
Yeah. Are you on Twitter? Someone was asking by chance.
I am not, but I do say some pretty hilarious things, so maybe I should.
Yeah, it's surprising. There's actually a lot of commercial real estate players on Twitter that they tweet all the time, which is interesting. But yeah, man. Well, thank you so much for those of you guys who are tuning in live. Again, thank you so much for stopping by. We have this bi-monthly, so feel free to go to the LinkedIn group and sign up. And remember that we do this on a regular basis, and we always bring in speakers from all over the country really to talk about these types of concepts. And yeah, wishing you all a happy Thanksgiving with your families, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks, everyone.
See you guys.